Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Galley marched over to where his elves were sleeping. He passed the slaves, all tied and collared. The wood elf girl was slumped on her knees with her arms wrapped around her chest, shaking in silent agony. He grunted a laugh to himself. He entertained the idea of leaving the collar active the following day as well. The way she shook. He licked his lips. Tonight was shaping up to be a very good night indeed. The guild boy had spilled what he knew, but only after an incredible amount of convincing with the collar. Galley had been surprised at how long it took him to break. Not impressed, simply surprised. When they tethered him to the rest of the slaves, he was crying. "Pathetic weakling," grunted Galley. Entering a small clearing just beyond the tree line, he clapped his hands loudly. Grumbles and complaints drifted to his ears as he clapped again. "Rise up, lads. Our last quarry is at hand. And it seems that our little weirder friend already got a collar around his neck for us." Shapes moved in the dark, and several wisp lights appeared around Galley. The rest of his band stood around him, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and yawning. They were annoyed at being woken, but the prospect of capturing the last of their prey superseded any complaints that they held. Within moments, all 7 of them were alert and ready. Galley continued, "The human mage known as Edmund Stormhand. He is the last. After we have him, we're off to the Southlands, to our homes." Galley looked at each elf in turn. "This is the final hunt, lads. Cobb and the others will stay to watch over the merchandise, keep them in line. Lorne." A broad, muscular elf grunted in acknowledgement from behind him. "Get everyone outfitted well. We don't know what this man is going to be like." The boy didn't have much to say in the matter. "Bring a couple of bolas and grab your whip. We're forming 2 teams. Lorne, pick your men. I'll take the rest. Since Stormhand has a collar on him already, we won't need to worry about his magic. We can also track him by picking up on its noise. You all know what they sound like." By this time, the group had split into 2, half surrounding Lorne and the others standing near Galley. They were all awake and alert, listening closely to what he was saying. Lorne, large arms folded across his chest, cleared his throat. "The order was quite clear. Stormhand must be taken alive and unmaimed. Any physical damage done will result in a deduction from our pay. Understood?" The elves all nodded. Lorne continued. "Good. The order also mentioned that he possesses great magical strength. If you find him and he isn't wearing a collar, group up. While he obviously can't match any of us, his name suggests he knows his way around a spell or 2. I don't want any of you getting caught off guard. Be aware of this ahead of time. He is strong. Don't underestimate him, and he won't get the better of you. If he attacks you with magic, break him. If he tries to defend himself with magic, crush him. Make sure he comprehends that a human cannot match an elf with ley magic. Any questions before we start?" They stood in silence for a moment, then Galley nodded. "Good. Let's be off then. I want to be back before the dawn with the last prisoner added to the line. And Lorne, bring an extra collar, just to be sure." The 2 groups split and headed into the forest. Galley opened his mind to his magic, feeling out into the night for that faint yet familiar metallic sound. The wind blew lazily through the treetops, rustling the leaves quietly. The boy had said that Stormhand was probably headed west into the Witchwood. Galley led his group in that direction. None of them had picked up on the collar yet, but that was understandable. The mage had a few hours on them, and would have camped carefully so as to lose the weirder. The notes given to them as part of the order had also specified that Stormhand had spent several years with the Eastern Wildkin, so he would be adept at making himself hidden in the woods. Galley was banking on him wearing the collar. "The boy had better not have lied about that," he growled to himself. The night wore on, and the search continued. The 2 groups headed farther and farther west along the forest's edge. There was still no sign of the collar, and Galley was growing irritated. "If the boy did lie, so help me I'll cut off his thumbs," muttered Galley. They had stopped for a short rest and were dining on some dried meat that Cobb had given them before they left. One of the mountain elves, Rel, was sitting down with his back to a tree and his legs folded beneath him. His eyes were closed tightly in concentration. Galli had ordered him to keep searching with his magic, just in case. Suddenly, Rel jerked up his head and stared westward with his eyes wide open. The rest of the group noticed immediately, and all looked expectantly at Rel as he gazed intently into the night. Galli swallowed the dried meat and stepped into a crouch near Rel's side. "Well, what is it?" he asked in a whisper. Rel paused a moment before answering. "I think it's him. A collar just sparked a couple 100 yards in that direction." He pointed excitedly westward. A low hum sounded amongst the elves as the rest of them opened their minds and searched the dark forest to the west. Galli smiled as he felt the cold metallic ring of an active collar. "That's him, lads. It has to be." He stood up. "Rel, reach out and contact Lorne and the others, and have them meet us here. The rest of you wait for them. I'm going to scout the area. I'll be back as soon as I can. Hopefully Lorne will be here then, and we can plan our next move." The elves all crouched down in the bushes and became silent. Galli loped off into the darkness. His mind was open, guiding him toward the sound of the collar. It was an echoing sound, like someone had struck a bell with a mallet, and Galli was listening to the ringing. It grew fainter and fainter with every passing moment. Galli quickened his pace as much as he dared. He didn't want to give away his presence to the mage. Finally, he began to catch glimpses of a small, flickering light between the branches. Slowing down to a quick, careful walk, Galli let go of his magic and focused on his stealthy approach. He came to the edge of a tiny encampment. The grass had all been matted down, and branches were placed in a perimeter around the camp, with the fire in the middle. Galli peered out of the shadows, straining to see into the cleared area. A lone figure sat on a log next to the fire. His back was slumped, and his head was bobbing in and out of sleep. Galli grinned to himself in the darkness. Stormhand wouldn't know what had hit him. Something moved by the fire, and an alluring, musty smell drifted to his nose. Galli suppressed the urge to take several quick steps backward into the night, for there, lying next to the fire, was an Olma doe. Galli cursed his luck. An uncollared female Olma was sharing the campfire of his quarry. He covered his mouth with a hand and thought. There was no telling how strong the Olma was with the wild spirit. She could easily kill several of his men before they brought her down, or she might not be able to wield the magic at all. Galli stifled an exasperated groan. Her scent was making it hard to think straight. A plan slowly began to form through the fog in his head. He quietly crept backward into the night, disappearing into the shadows. Galli headed to meet up with the elves he had left, and by the time he reached them, Lorne's group had also arrived. As Galli stepped into the midst of the gathered elves, he broke the news in a low voice. "Well, lads, I have some good news and some bad news, and some more good news. Which would you like to hear first?" Lorne, with arms folded across his chest, answered impatiently. "Is Stormhand there or not, Galli? I'm not in the mood for games. Answer plainly." Galli continued as though he hadn't heard him. "The bad news first, then. Stormhand is traveling with an Olma doe." The elves around him who had sat down immediately stood up again and began whispering to each other. The annoyed sneer vanished from Lorne's mouth, replaced with a concerned frown. "An Olma?" he asked quickly. "Bloody hammer. Is she an Olsian? A wild sister? Can she use the magic?" None of them relished the idea of butting heads with a female Olma, figuratively or literally. They were dangerously unpredictable, and not at all fond of elves. Galli waited a moment and then cleared his throat. "Lorne, do you have the extra collar?" Lorne nodded. "I don't see how that helps us. She'll kill half of us before we can get close enough to get it on her." Galli held up a hand. "She's asleep." Lorne stood in silence before responding slowly. "She's asleep? She's not keeping watch?" Galli smiled. "That's the good news." The elves in the group looked around at each other in disbelief. Galli continued. "Apparently, she trusts the mage enough to sleep while he keeps guard. Too bad, though. He's falling asleep as we speak. All we have to do is sneak up on them and get the collar around her neck. It'll be the easiest catch we've ever made." "Except for the weirder boy," piped up one of the elves. Galli chuckled. "Of course, it would be rather difficult to beat that one. Practically fell into our hands. Anyway, let's go bag ourselves a mage and a stickhead, then call it a night, shall we?" The rest of them gave a hushed hurrah before spreading out behind Galli and Lorne as they stalked towards the last of their quarry. Merritt lay on his side at the edge of a group of people who were all huddled together for warmth in the night. Most of them wore collars, but Merritt couldn't see all of them from where he lay. He shivered as the slaves shifted uneasily around him. They all could hear the elf girl weeping quietly in the shadows. Every now and then she would stifle a scream. Merritt guessed by the muffled sound that she was biting on something, perhaps a stick or a piece of leather from her belt. For some reason, her collar had been left active. None of them tried to help her. They all knew there was nothing they could do. She would either be strong and bear it, or she would break. Merritt's teeth had begun to chatter. The night seemed so much colder than it had yesterday. A sudden weight dropped onto his shoulders from behind, and a wonderful warmth began to seep into his body. He instinctively pulled the coat around him. Glancing behind him, he strained to see who had helped him. A petite, young-looking woman was kneeling at his side and smiling at him. "You were shivering," she said softly. "You look like you need my coat more than I do." "I'm fine," grumbled Merritt, but his hands instinctively gripped the coat tighter around his shoulders. The woman wore no collar, and neither were her hands tied nor her feet shackled. She smiled at him. "I'm from a village to the east up in the Northwoods. It gets much colder there." Merritt straightened his back stiffly and turned to face her. She was slender and shorter than him. Her face was round, coming to a soft point at her chin. Her black hair was held up in a bun behind her head, and wisps of loose curls fell over her face, blowing gently in the chilly breeze. Her skin, from what Merritt could tell in the darkness, was pale, like most tribal Northlanders, and at the edges of both her eyes, curving down across her cheekbones, were the dark, traditional tattoos of the old Northland clans. Merritt had read about similar markings within Olma tribes in the north as well, though their meaning was lost to him. His mind wandered to the mage. Merritt shirked away from that line of thought. He didn't want to think of what the elves would do to him when they caught up to him. They would probably kill the Olma. "I'm Sigrid," said the woman quietly. Her voice was motherly, yet young-sounding. Sitting back on the grass, she crossed her legs in front of her. Merritt grunted. "I'm Merritt Longstride. Good to meet you, I suppose." Sigrid arched an eyebrow and smirked. "Good to meet me? You do realize we're being taken to the Southlands to be sold as slaves, don't you?" Merritt didn't look at her. She went on. "How old are you, Merritt Longstride?" "I'm 16, answered Merritt sheepishly. "You?" 25, she said. "I was the first one they captured, many months ago. Well, I suppose Eric was the first." She paused a little before smiling at Merritt. "Eric?" he asked. As if on cue, a small boy appeared out of the shadows and plopped down into Sigrid's open lap. "I can't sleep, Mama. The elf lady's still crying." Sigrid hugged the little boy close to her chest. "This is Eric," she said through his hair to Merritt. "He is my little prince." She punctuated this last bit by ruffling Eric's hair with a gloved hand. The little boy had black hair like his mother, and a round face. He smiled a toothy grin at Sigrid. Merritt saw that the boy wore a collar around his neck, and understood why Sigrid, uncollared as she was, didn't try to escape from the slavers. "Your son," said Merritt. Eric struggled to his feet, out of Sigrid's grasp. "I am the firstborn of Reaganleaf the Wild." He puffed up his chest and tried his best to look menacing. The result was less than intimidating. Sigrid laughed and grabbed Eric around his waist. "Yes, he is my son, my one and only." She paused again, seeing the look in Merritt's eyes, a mixture of sorrow and fear. "Wherever he goes, so do I. And do not be deceived. They cannot keep the collar on him forever. When they sell him in the Southlands, they have to take it off, if only for a moment. I have escaped from worse situations, and I have no intention of seeing him sold as a slave." Merritt wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Sigurd continued. "I'm from Fjalstag. I would have fought the slavers tooth and nail before being taken. However, they found my weakness before I even had a chance. I had no other choice but to go with them. As long as they have that collar around his neck, I must stay." "Have you tried to remove it?" asked Merritt. Sigurd shook her head. "Even if I could get it off myself, they would know the moment it left his neck. There would be no escape. Besides," she tapped the symbol on Merritt's forehead with a finger, "you should know better than any that only the one who puts the collar on can take it off again, or control it for that matter. No, until they take it off him themselves, we are both prisoners. The leader, the one they call Galley, told me that if anything happened to any of the mountain elves, he would personally..." She paused, looking down at Eric. "Let's just say that I've already had to stifle 2 separate escape attempts amongst the prisoners that involved killing the elves." She leaned a little closer to Merritt. They're counting on my fear to persuade the others. The night wore on. Merritt and Sigrid talked a little longer, but soon both of them became tired and moved into the middle of the other slaves to keep warm. Merritt fell asleep next to Sigrid, with Eric curled up between them both. In the shadows, the elf girl continued to grind her teeth in the throes of pain. Galli and Lorne crouched in the waning shadows just outside the mage's camp. The rest of the elves waited slightly behind them. Galli had given up counting how many times the mage had almost fallen asleep. "Bloody hammer, does the man not sleep?" muttered Lorne. "Maybe the collar is keeping him awake," suggested Galli in a low voice. They waited a little longer before Galli grunted and said, "Let's get this over with before he wakes up completely." Lorne nodded and pulled out the collar from his pack. With a low hum, barely audible above the crackle of the fire, Lorne silenced his footsteps with a quietly hummed spell. Slowly, he made his way around the camp circle and stood just above the sleeping Olma. Thin wisps of smoke from the campfire blew over the Olma and into his face. Realizing that he would have to step into the mage's line of sight to get the collar around her neck, Lorne stood motionless and waited for Galli's signal. Galli had taken a moment to position himself behind the mage, deciding it would be best to try and steal the mage's sword before he woke. He wasn't afraid of being overpowered by the mage. No human could match the speed and grace of an elf with a sword. Still, the whole ordeal would be over more quickly if Stormhand had no delusions about fighting back. Finding Lorne with his eyes, Galli gave a nod. Lorne stepped into the camp and stooped over the sleeping Olma, carefully working the collar around her neck without touching her. Galli slowly reached out with a hand toward the sword. However, before he could grab it, the mage jerked his head up, and seeing Lorne, leapt to his feet, snatching the sword up with him. The sudden movement woke the Olma from her slumber. She found herself staring right at Lorne, who was still stooping above her, locking the collar into place. Lashing out with her elbow before Lorne could react, she knocked him off his feet. She scrambled to stand up, but Lorne took control of her through the collar and forced her to her knees. The mage dashed over to where Lorne had recovered himself, and, in a movement quicker than Galli imagined possible for a human, he had whipped his sword tip to the side of Lorne's neck and growled threateningly, "Release her!" He slid the sword tip slightly across Lorne's flesh, drawing blood. "Now!" Lorne's eyes bulged with surprise. Galli acted quickly. "He can't let her go, Stormhand," he bluffed. "I control the collar. You'll have to face me." With one hand, Galli drew his sword and pointed it at the mage. He would end this quickly. Stormhand glanced between them before removing the sword from Lorne's neck and turning to face Galli. He started toward him, but stopped when his companion began to scream, the collar tightening around her neck. Galli continued as Stormhand glared at him. "Unfortunately, I have no intention of fighting with you. Now, drop your sword or the stickhead dies." Lorne helped drive the point home by giving the Olma an extra sharp stab of pain through the collar, making her cry out. Stormhand gave the elf a brief look of malice before slowly bending down and placing his sword on the ground. He straightened up with his hands out and open. "All right, what do you want?" Galli smirked and pointed at him. "You, Stormhand," he said. "We want you. You're the last of the Special Order. With you, my band of merry elves and I can return to the Southland to be met with wine, women, and riches." Lorne grunted in agreement from across the clearing. He held a hand to his neck where the mage had cut him. Stormhand looked uneasily toward his companion. "All right, I'll go with you." This was met by a protest from the Olma. "River, no!" Lorne cut her off with a sharp jab from the collar. "I'll go with you willingly, but let her go. If it's me you want, that's fine, but you have no interest in her." Galli smiled again, looking greedily at the prostrate Olma. "Well, I never said I didn't have any interest in her. We're always paid handsomely for any wildkin we come across in our travels. Unfortunately, they usually die rather than become subservient." The mage went white in the face. "Don't do this." "Beg me," Galli demanded with a grin. "Beg me to let her go." "Please," said Stormhand grudgingly, teeth clenched. Galli pulled out his belt knife and pressed it to the mage's neck. "Please," said the man again softly, "I'm begging you. Let her go. You can have me, I will go with you peacefully, but only let her go free." Galli chuckled. "No." Well, that wraps up this chapter. Stay tuned for the next chapter of the Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand coming soon. In the meantime, you can head over to Amazon and pick up your very own copy. The link is in the description. Leave a comment and a like, make sure to subscribe for more content, and until next time, enjoy the adventure.